Well, thank you, Carolyn and Marilyn and the MDI for inviting me. As Carolyn was saying, we had postponed this lecture. It was meant to take place about a year ago today, and given the quickly changing situation in the country, we just didn't think the timing was right. So, as Carolyn has explained, we agreed that it was time to bring back some positive attention to a country that's in very serious trouble. And to try to remind a broader audience about the heritage of that country, the cultural treasures of Yemen. And I think that everybody here is already aware of them, so I don't think that I'm going to be saying anything new to those of you who are here in the audience. But as Carolyn mentioned, this is really this is a prelude to an exhibition that we will be working on together that will highlight the architecture of Yemen, and that will be taking place in 2017 here at SOAS at the Brunei Gallery, being very generously funded by the MBI Al Jaber Foundation. And so this is just a precursor to that exhibition. So I'll tell you a little bit about the order of the talk that I'm going to give in just a moment. But I have an announcement to make. I received an email last week from a colleague in Venice who wanted me to share with you the news that the Istituto Veneto per i Beni Culturali is going to be hosting a series of initiatives and programs to do with Yemen. The chairman of the Istituto is going to be, in fact, curating the Yemeni pavilion for the architectural exhibition in this year's Venice Biennale, which opens at the end of May. So they too feel that it's time to start showcasing and bringing world attention to the country. And I think too, for all of us who are familiar with the country and the region, well, we know about that, and that we need to focus on the tragedy that's unfolding there and what we can do about it. But when I would speak to my younger students, for instance, at SOAS, when I would be teaching them and lecturing to them, and I would show them pictures of my field work in the 1990s in Yemen, they were absolutely amazed. They had never heard of the architecture there, the architectural tradition there. They didn't. The only thing that they knew about the country was what they were listening to on the news. And that's not delivering any kind of positive message. So this is just to try to recalibrate a little bit of a balance. So the Istituto Veneto is going to be have a hand in curating the Yemeni pavilion, and also they're going to be working in collaboration with the Italian Archaeological Mission in Yemen to stage an exhibition on the archaeology, art, and architecture, heritage in danger. That's going to take place at the National Museum of Oriental Art in Venice, and that will start this autumn. So if any of you happen to have the good chance of being in Venice at a later point this year, you might enjoy also some nice views of Yemen. My talk tonight, I'm going to try to make sure that I stay within my time limit, is broken into 3 parts. I think that there's no way that I can begin a lecture on the architecture of Yemen without just at least giving an overview of what's going on there at the moment and the threat that armed conflict is bringing to the country. So I will just highlight some of the main tragedies to the architectural heritage of the country. Before presenting, then I'll start moving towards something more positive, and I'm going to just present a very brief survey of the diversity of architecture in the country, just to give you an idea of the kind of regions that are going to be contained in the exhibition that we're going to be curating in 2017. And then the final bit of the lecture, which is kind of the main core of it, I'm going to focus on my own research, working with minaret builders. As Carolyn said, I worked as a laborer stroke apprentice, mostly a laborer, for a 13-month period to get my PhD in anthropology. And I was studying particularly the apprenticeship system, so the transmission of knowledge, the way builders worked and learned on site. And I obviously was able to gain first-hand experience and some back pain as well in doing so, which gave me a better insight into the way the knowledge is accumulated. So, before I start, I think that it's just important to point out that there has been an enormous number of civilian casualties, and thousands, perhaps millions, have been displaced in the country. And another great tragedy is the destruction of heritage in Yemen. My feeling is, as somebody who's interested in material culture, not material culture as objects out there, but they are the things that people make. And in making them, people develop their own identities as professionals and tradespeople. Identity is often made through the hands. Like a pianist or a guitar player, a mason or a carpenter places a lot of identity in what they're able to do with their handwork and their fingerwork. And I think that we need to look at the heritage and not try to dissect it from the people, and also from a purely economic perspective. The architectural heritage of Yemen is important because when I was privileged to be there, and others in the room, Yemen was, there was an open window for a time in the history of Yemen, and we were able to travel through the country and open the eyes of Yemenis to our world and learn a great deal about theirs. And it also brought some economic hope to the country, that the world is interested in what we build and what we do. It would be lovely to hopefully see that one day again. But anyways, in the meantime, really, since March, the struggle between the incumbent president Hadi and the Houthi soldiers, of course, backed by the Houthi rebels, backed by those soldiers loyal to the former president Saleh, has really plunged into a civil war. And of course, it has set the stage for a greater regional conflict between Sunni Saudi and Shiite Iran. And that's even expanded to a network of global players, of course, including the US and Britain, who have given support to the terrible bombing campaigns in the country, either through the sales of arms or as part of the coalition. Approximately 3,000 civilians have died, and about 2/3 of those have been killed in bombing campaigns. So the bombing campaigns are serious, and the bombing campaigns are also destroying houses, city walls, and villages. It's estimated currently that approximately 2.3 million people, that's nearly 10% of the population, are considered to be displaced. So just for an overview, do you mind is it possible to lower the notes? Do you know?
I'm sure it is.
If it's possible, if the technology is there, it would be great. Because my presentation tonight is quite heavily visual. That's fine for me if it's okay for everybody in the audience. Is everybody okay? Yeah? Good. This first view is of the northern city of Sada. And of course, it's also the Sada province is also the heartland of the Houthi movement, and therefore has come under very direct bombardment by the Saudis, by the Saudi-led coalition. But it's really important to recognize the history of this place too. Sada city, the foundations of Sada city may date back to the 4th century BC. So it's a very ancient place, but now it's a military zone. And as many of you may know, on the 8th of May in 2015, the Saudi-led coalition declared Sada city to be a military zone and gave the resident population 24 hours to evacuate. They destroyed a city called Rahban nearby. I'll point that out in just a moment. And then the following day, bombed Sada, hitting the marketplace very close to the 9th century Al-Hadi Mosque, which is right here. These are pictures that were taken on my visit there, and to the villages surrounding Sada, which are built in what's called the Zabur style. It's a rammed earth style, so there's no mud brick or cob construction, rather it's rammed earth construction. It goes up layer by layer. These are the kind of things that will be covered in some detail in the exhibition, and also the Al-Hadi Mosque. And these are the aftermaths of both the city and the market square in front of the mosque, which left the dome cracked and the building structurally unstable. In Sana'a, the city that I know best, the Al-Qasimi neighborhood was bombed in June on 2015. And in fact, I put this picture here because this is the house that I lived in during my field work in Yemen. And directly across this square was part of the Qasimi neighborhood. And this is the aftermath of the bombing that happened there. These were absolutely beautiful houses, some dating thought to be approximately 1,000 years old. There was, of course, subsequent bombing on September 19th as well, killing more people in an extended family dwelling. But it hasn't been concentrated on just the capital and other large cities, but even highland cities such as Kalkaban have been subject to military combat. And this is a picture of the surrounding fortification. City walls are fortified, but you can see the destruction here. And the kind of beautiful stone architecture, which I'm going to come back to, in the mountain towns, not far from Sana'a, in fact. Perhaps a city that we hear about a great deal as well is Taiz, to the south of Sana'a. And after the Houthi rebels took the Kahira fort, which is thought to be about 1,000 years old, they aimed the cannons down to strategic sites on the city to aim at the popular resistance. And of course, that brought the attention of the Saudi-led coalition. And you can see the fort under bombardment there up in flames. Taiz has been not just hit by bombs and military action, but also the blockades have stopped the supply of food and medical supplies and all other sorts of crucial things to keep life going there. I won't continue with pictures of the destruction, but just to mention a few other sites. Even the Hadrami city, the Hadramat city of Shibam, had some destruction done to it in November last year. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for a blast at a military checkpoint, which did damage to some of the high-rise mud skyscrapers. I'll show you some pictures of those in just a moment. In Mukalla, further to the south, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in April destroyed a number of Sufi shrines. Fortunately, I saw the same kind of thing going on in Mali, another place that's very dear to my heart and where I worked for years, in the city of Timbuktu. In Marib, the ancient dam suffered bombardment on May 31st. Ancient Sabian inscriptions were destroyed, and by autumn last year, the Marib region became a frontline battleground between the coalition troops and the Houthi forces. Barakish, one of the most incredible pre-Islamic cities, its height, zenith in the 5th century BC, and continually inhabited until the 19th century AD, just layers upon layers of civilization, beautiful walled city. Also bombed, Stone Curtain Wall, completely destroyed. It's an uninhabited city. I mean, so you know why this was bombed. And one of the really horrible things was the destruction of several pre-Islamic temples, which had been painstakingly restored by the Italian archaeological mission in Yemen. It was a horrible day for them. The last bit of bad news before I move on to something else is in Damar, south of Sana'a, really a cradle of ancient South Arabian civilizations. A very important project was led by the University of Chicago there. It was called the Damar Survey Project. And over 400 sites were surveyed and objects collected, including many scripts. They were displayed and stored in a museum there, and the museum was blown to bits. And they lost over 12,000 artifacts in the bombardment. Now, in addition to the military activity, Yemen's architectural heritage also faces a lot of other challenges, and it has for a very long time. Despite popular belief, the maintenance of traditional architecture and even building new buildings in traditional style costs a great deal of money. And one of the reasons for that is because it's very labor intensive. Think about it in your own terms. If you need a dining room table, you could probably get a very good quality table if you went to Heels. Or you could pay a craftsman to have one made, bespoke. And I can tell you that the bespoke one is going to cost you a whole lot more because of the hours that go into it. And it's the same thing with the traditional. And the traditional building also requires continual maintenance. So there are costs involved. Also, it's not a few isolated towns and cities or a few buildings here and there. The country is absolutely replete with important architectural sites. And it's a living architecture. It's not a museumified architecture. It's towns and villages that are lived in. And to maintain and restore that vast quantity of architecture is incredibly costly for what is one of the poorest nations on earth. Also, one of the challenges that traditional architecture faces, particularly in urban areas like Sana'a and Sada, is that the emerging middle classes that really began in the 1970s moved progressively out of the old cities. They were looking for modern conveniences, different style homes. Consumer tastes were changing, and they were abandoning their living quarters in the old cities and renting out the family properties to newcomers who were coming in from the countryside, but who didn't have the means to maintain the buildings. This was a big issue when I was in Sana'a, and buildings were already falling apart then. And the question of how to maintain them was at the top of the agenda. And along with that came increasing vehicular traffic. Cars and trucks coming increasingly from the 1970s. Sana'a today has major traffic jams. And vehicular traffic doesn't just need wider roads, but it needs a different kind of infrastructure underneath the roads. Trucks and cars going through the old cities are causing small tremors. And the building structures are suffering as a consequence. Also, there has been more and more imported building materials, but also construction technologies. And these are replacing older locally available materials and technologies. And this goes along with perceptions that tradition is associated with backwardness. Many Sananis that I knew when I was there, those from kind of the middle and upper middle classes whose families had moved outside to the expanding suburbs, loved the old city and wanted it to stay exactly the same, but didn't want to live there. It was inconvenient. But they really liked the idea that it still represented tradition. It represented kind of, the moral foundations of Yemeni society. And but they themselves didn't want to live there. So there's this kind of tension, which exists in lots of different places that have kind of heritage sites. People love them, it's part of their identity, it's absolutely important to the cultural identity of the place, but people that can afford not to live there don't necessarily live there. Anyways, let me move into the next part of my talk. I just want to introduce to you a few regions before I start talking about Sana'a and the Minaret builders. And I just want to give you a taste of the architectural diversity in the country and how it responds to a number of different parameters, including, very importantly, the economic histories of the different regions and even of the different locales, whether it's on a mountaintop or on a plain, and the trade that passed through those particular locations or that bypassed it. And the trade brought not only wealth along the trade routes, very important trade routes that went mainly from south to north and up into the Northern Arabian Peninsula, often to the Mediterranean, but that also brought changing ideas and changing tastes and new technologies and new furnishings for the home, new glass, colored glass for fan lights, etc. Also, the architecture has responded historically to the changing security situation in regions. What's going on in, Sheila and I were talking before, plus ça change. The Yemen has been a site of a region of conflict for a very long period, and this is the latest, perhaps the most destructive chapter in that violence. But there has often been insecurity, violence, warfare, tribal dispute. And so security has also played a major role in the kind of architecture and the defensive architecture that's formed and where people build. Also, political issues in the country that go along with those security issues. Gender relations have played a major part in the way that houses are planned. The segregation of women from men and children within the house, etc. And also, the segregation of different family members in these large extended family dwellings. Social class hierarchies that are reflected not just in economics but also in religious terms in Yemen have also had a big impact on where houses are situated, clusters of houses together, the height of houses, style of houses. Nicholas and I were looking at Nicholas's beautiful book, photographs taken by a Yemeni Jew in the 1930s to 40s who lived in the Dar Yahud, the Jewish quarter, where the houses had a restriction on the number of stories that could be built. So religion, your position within religion, and your economic position all had a role to play in the kind of house that you built for yourself or where you were going to live. Climate and topography obviously play a huge role. And as I go through the pictures, you'll see that influence. I think it's probably most clear. Yemen, who hasn't been to Yemen? Okay, a few. Okay. What an incredibly diverse place, climatically, geographically, architecturally. And that has all played a role in the expression of architecture. And the topography, as you can see, plays a major role in where buildings are sited and how they're built. Also, the properties of the materials that were available. In other words, what the materials themselves can do structurally. Does the stone in this region allow you to build multi-story buildings, or is it safer to just build one story? Is this an earthquake zone? What's the quality of the mud? How much clay does it have in it? What's the sand-clay mix? All of these things, the properties of the materials, also dictate what you can do structurally with the building. Very importantly, too, are systems of sharing knowledge. There is no unified system of apprenticeship, globally or even within Yemen. Different cities and towns and over history have different apprenticeship systems with different hierarchies within and different ways of transmitting the knowledge from one generation to the next. And so that passing down of hands-on knowledge also plays a major role in the kind of technical solutions that builders are able to come up with. So just to give you an overview of some of the pictures, I just wanted to first start off with the Highlands. And just, it gives you an idea of the kind of isolation of a lot of the towns and villages up in the mountains. But then what I think this picture also shows are these really scary roads, for any of you who've driven on them. The roads that have now connected these villages, to the main road networks. And of course, it's along roads that people's new goods, plastic bags, and new ways of living and ideas have made their way into the small towns. Anybody who was in Yemen, say from the late 80s onwards, saw the kind of the evolving forest or fields of plastic bags. That unfortunately, but this is stuff that comes in with road systems. And it has an impact on the building environment. Also, what's important to mention is the integration of the architecture with the landscape. The mountains are often steep and terraced. The villages and regions are still, to some extent, and certainly were historically self-reliant, reliant on their own subsistence agriculture. A lot of the fields have been turned over to cot production. And the other thing I was going to say about oh yes, and this is important as well. The villages themselves and houses, individual houses, are strategically built on outcrops where you can't produce food. You don't build where you can actually grow something. Everything you grow is going to be important. So that also had a major impact on the siting buildings. There's also the use of locally available materials, so plenty of stone in the high mountains, and also the use of locally developed structural solutions to challenges. Where you live in an area that's full of crevices, and you're building on a steep incline, you have to develop arch systems that are going to support the houses above it. I also think what's interesting here is this is a village house, is the way that urban aesthetics, the idea of kind of the decorated facade, makes its way into the rural countryside from the cities. So the villages were always connected in some way to the towns. And the villages themselves are not just an assembly of houses, but they also contain large number of public buildings, and beautifully built as well. Mosques, shrines, tombs, bathhouses, marketplaces, and a lot of other public spaces where neighborhoods or whole villages could congregate either within the village or somewhere outside it, often to settle disputes or negotiate projects together. Another important feature of many Yemeni villages and towns are the water cisterns or water tanks that are often lined with qadad plaster, which is made in a complex way, but it's waterproof. And the water cisterns are not only important just as a place to keep your water supply, but they also serve a very important social function. It's where often women and children congregate and socialize in the villages. In the outlying regions, individual houses are often built in a rather defensive fashion, with their own enclosure walls, and often in tower-like form, whether it's stone or in mud down on the plains. And the reason for this is that on a round building, there is simply no corner to take out. On a square building or a square tower, as soon as you take out the corner, a battering ram or with an explosive, the building will be structurally unstable and will crumble. And it's much more difficult to bring down a round tower. And that's why in some places you still see beautifully preserved round towers. You often see them still in agricultural fields. This is just to give you an idea of some of the towns just north of Sana'a. This is Amran, which uses stone for its defensive walls, and the majority of the houses in the historic town are built in puddled earth. And then if we move down to the Tahama plain, we see an entirely different kind of architecture. One that has been very heavily influenced in the cross-fertilization between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which is not so far away, just across the Red Sea. Beautiful, single-story, extended family dwellings, compounds, that one would expect to see possibly in the Horn or other parts of East Africa, and gorgeously decorated inside, usually by the women of the household. Also on the Tama is the historic city of Zabid, made in kiln-baked brick and beautiful plasterwork. Just to give you an idea of the sense of kind of cross-cultural fertilization, it's towns like these where you really see the influence of the Indian Ocean trade, but also Egyptian and Ottoman influence. Of course, the Ottomans were in the Tama in the 16th and 17th, and then again in the 19th century, always having a difficult time in Yemen. But certainly they're long enough to bring influence to the architecture and the decoration. And then the great trade cities of the coast, of the Red Sea coast, like Al-Moqa and also Al-Haya, built in coral construction often, and exhibiting many Indian Ocean influences. And people that have carefully studied these towns know that often Gujarati boat builders came to the coast, and when they weren't working on boats, found work as carvers and carpenters working on houses in these trade cities. Then there is some beautiful cities and towns south of Sana'a. Just for example, Jibla, the Sulayhid, the capital of the 11th and 12th century, on your left, and on the right, the gorgeous Amaria Mosque and Madrasa complex, and that's before it was restored in the 1990s by Salma Radi. And then, of course, perhaps very famously, the Wadi Hadramat, which is spectacular geographically in itself, with incredible diversity even within the region of architecture. And this is, of course, Shibam, which I had mentioned before, suffered some damage during a recent explosion. And the multi-story buildings, 7 and 8 stories, are built in sun-dried mud brick. Also in the Wadi Hadramat are pilgrimage sites and saints' tombs, the whitewashed houses of Al-Hajarain, and then the really stunning houses of towns and cities like Tarim, which are made in mud, this palace below. These individual kind of grand merchant houses built by Hadrami merchants who traveled to Southeast Asia and came back with ideas that they took from there architecturally, many of them, of course, from Java, which had been influenced by the Dutch. So it's kind of Dutch Baroque architecture coming via Java back to the south of Yemen, and built gorgeously in mud. And of course, restoring and maintaining these palaces has been the project of a number of academics and scholars and architectural conservationists. Also, southern towns on the coast. I continue here. And then before we get into Yemen, the famous Dar al-Hajj, which was built only in the 1930s for the ruling imam. And an incredible feat of architectural and structural engineering, and stands today as a popular tourist site and place to visit for Somalis and foreigners alike. And this brings me on to the core of my talk about minaret building and apprenticeship in Yemen. When I began fieldwork, studies on Yemeni architecture were largely focused on the buildings themselves and not on the builders who did them. And as an anthropologist, that's what interested me, was the social component and the learning component and the cognitive component that goes into that learning. In the past, all Yemeni men who wanted to become builders would migrate to larger towns or cities, and they would find themselves a placement, often starting off as a laborer and hopefully moving up to the position of apprentice, with an usta, or a master, and they would learn their trade there. And prior to the 1970s, there were no trained architects and engineers working in the country. There were Ottoman engineers who built some incredible structures like the one in my opening slide, that bridge, that gorgeous. But for the most part, there were no engineers, no drawn plans. It was the usta that really had the major power to produce and reproduce the building heritage of his city or of his region. And that was still very much the case when I was there, despite the fact that a lot of modern building was encroaching on Sana'a. Now, the builders themselves, the traditional builders, they call themselves Taqlidi, traditional builders. And there was no guild structure. In many parts of the Middle East, crafts are centered around guild-like structures. But there was an absence of this for the builders in Sana'a, who I worked with. There was no central point in the city or the souk where they congregated, and they lived dispersed in different parts of the city, though there was communication as they would visit each other on their building sites and chew crafts together. So there was exchange of ideas, and sometimes masons would loan their apprentices to other builders. So they would kind of share the training, but also share ideas. So the usta really had, the master had an obligation of safeguarding the integrity of their own building house, their trade, and they had the responsibility of making sure that they were building something that would be satisfying to their clients and safe to live in. So that responsibility was taken not by a guild, but really by themselves as individual families. My field work with masons took place for 13 months in 1996-97, and I was there, as I said before, really to learn about learning. to better understand the transmission of knowledge, how they acquired their technical skills, but also how they became the social people they would become as craftspeople. I worked with a team that was specialized in minaret building, and it was completely by chance. I don't have the time to really go into that now, how I came to work with them. I never thought that I would land up working with minaret. I thought I'd work with house builders, and I was lucky enough to meet this family and to work with them. But the family itself, the first builder in the family was Ali Said al-Maswari, and that was the name of the family, al-Maswari, and he came to Sana'a from the Dammar region in the 1930s and moved into a neighborhood called Banya. And progressively, the family established their reputation as really good builders. His sons worked for him, and they got increasingly prestigious commissions, including a growing number of minarets. And as they acquired these prestigious commissions, they also moved economically into the middle classes, which meant that it became more and more difficult to recruit their own children and grandchildren into the trades. Their children were going to college and going to university or setting up business. And just to be brief about this, the master masons of the family would say, we want one of our children at least to work in our trade, but at the same time they would say, we don't want our children doing this backbreaking work. We hope that they will become merchants or traders or computer engineers. One of the family members was studying computers. So my order of discussion this evening, for the rest of the evening, will focus on the minaret, and I'm going to move kind of progressively from the building of foundations of the minaret to the tower, the middle tower structure, to the dome. And in parallel to that, I'll also be looking at the three main stages of a builder's career, starting off with the lowly laborer, moving to the apprentice, and then ultimately to the qualified mason, and then master. The Adil minaret was the first minaret. I'll show you a picture of it later. It was a minaret for an old mosque called the Adil Mosque, and it was located in the beautiful Bir al-Azib quarter outside the old city. And it's interesting because Al-Khafanji, who was a poet, wrote in the mid-18th century a poem called The Mosques of Sana'a. And he predicts that, it's quite nice, he gives kind of life and character to all of the mosques as they speak to each other about wanting a minaret, and poor Adil Mosque was too poor and had no minaret. And I was really lucky when I got there. Finally, a patron had come along and paid for the building of a minaret for this mosque. And it's important to note too that minarets are often built as separate constructions from the mosque building itself, and often at a much later date, so when patrons have money to pay for them. Minarets also in Sana'a were popularly referred to as Sama'a rather than Manara. And Sama'a means cell or small monk's cell, and it refers to the small room that was often located on the roof of a mosque that gave the mueddin, the person who makes the call to prayer, some shelter during bad weather. So they still refer to these towering structures, though, as Sama'a. And there has long been a question of the appropriateness of building a minaret for a mosque in Zaydi Islam. Going back to the medieval period, Zaydi scholars already in Tabaristan, in northern Iran, and also in Highland Yemen, questioned whether minarets should be built above the roofline and whether mihrabs should be decorated, because it was felt that they detracted the attention to the decoration and the structure of the building rather than to prayer. But despite this, there was definitely a renaissance of minaret building activity going on in Sana'a from the late 1980s onward. And it was mostly being built by the Bayt al-Maswari, the masons, the family of masons who I worked with, who by the time I arrived in the late 1990s had built more than 25 minarets. And these are six examples of the minarets that they built in different materials, always with slightly different decoration. And their benchmark was the early 16th century minaret of the Madrasa mosque in the Old City. Not only did they use it kind of as a benchmark for proportion and decoration, but that's also the minaret that I later learned they went to try to learn how to build a minaret structure. It's no easy structure. You don't just make it up after having built a few houses. Now, in building minarets, it was really important to get the siting right. So there was a lot of strategy that went into the siting. This depended on the slope of the land and the soil conditions, but it was also important to use the space often within a mosque compound to site it perfectly, and also to maximize its visibility. The minarets that the Al-Maswari masons built were always aligned with the cardinal directions rather than toward Mecca, which would be slightly northwest. They were always aligned with the true north, like the Madrasa minaret. And it's thought by scholars that the Madrasa minaret was not just a place to make the call to prayer, but it also served astronomical and chronometric purposes as well. And the Al-Maswari continued that tradition of building to the true north. And for them, the minaret was an important marker, as Jonathan Bloom would describe the minaret. It marked the site of the religious institution within the neighborhood, also announced the neighborhood more widely on the skyline of the city. And it also was a marker for the piety of the patron who paid to build it. Very importantly for the Masons, it was also a marker for the reputation of them as craftspeople, something that they defended fiercely, and I think that my example later will show that up. The first part of the building to be built is the square-planned stone base of the minaret, the Murabba al-Hajar. And at first the ground is broken and excavated to a depth of 5-6 meters, depending on where it's located in the city, but always to bedrock. And then that hole is filled with basalt, big basalt boulders, boulders of basalt stone. They call it jum. And interestingly, the same reference is made in Jamal al-Din Ali's mid-18th century City of Divine and Earthly Joy, which was beautifully translated by Tim McIntosh Smith. So the hole is filled with basalt and with quicklime mortar in order to form a really strong footing or foundation for towers that would rise up to 60 meters and sometimes more. In the middle of a neighborhood that's densely populated, it's absolutely crucial that the engineering is done well. Once they get closer to grade, they start laying out courses of basalt stone, but they call this cut basalt stone differently. They call it al-Hajar al-Aswada. And many of the stone types are named either after their colors or after the region they come from. And they use these kind of roughly cut stones to start building up the first courses to slightly above grade. The reason why they use basalt is because it's extremely heavy and it's also extremely dense. And it's impermeable to water infiltration. Therefore, you don't have minerals and salts moving in capillary action upward into the structure. It's the muwakkis, or the stonemason, who cuts the stones to size with really simple instruments, his very heavy zubra hammer, and also with a length of iron piping to measure the dimensions of each of the stones, and with his zawiya, which is an iron angle to measure the squareness of each of the stones. Then above that, above the first few courses, the rest of the base is made in a different kind of stone called Habash stone. Habash referring to Abyssinia, to the blackness of the stone. It's in fact a porous volcanic stone which is quarried in the Damar region, and it's brought to site, and it is the muwakkis, the stonemason, hand chisels diagonal striping into the stone to give it a facing, a rustic facing, and also to help water run off. Today, that stone is machine cut. So here you can see the building of the square tower. So you have the basalt stone below and the habash stone above, and you have a professional stone cutter now cutting blocks to dimension, but they're still finished off on their facing by the muwakkis, and they're still tailored to their exact size by the muwakkis by hand. The base needs to be made perfectly square and level, and this is done with a really simple method, hydraulic method of clear plastic hosing with water in it, brought from one corner to the next to calibrate the height of the stone courses from corner to corner, just using the level of the water. And any changes that need to be made are made immediately on site to the coursing. And this is done level by level by level. And of course, with a plumb line, they also check the verticality over and over again. And that's the case all the way up the structure. Standardly, the bases of the al-Masri minarets are 4.5 meters square, but the height of them depends on the total height that they will be building the minaret. Roughly about 1/4 of the total height will be constituted by the initial square base tower. Inside of that, you can see that there is a circular space where, of course, the spiral staircase will go up. And interestingly, in counterclockwise direction, which I'll come back to. And in the case of the Adil Mosque, this was 2.4 meters in diameter, and at its center was a stone column that goes all the way up from bottom to top. And likewise, the diameter of the staircase stays consistent all the way through the tower to the very top, to the dome level. The circular stones of the column are cut again by the muwakkis on site, working down below. And in this case, he has a bent piece of reinforced steel to fit the curvature of the 65 centimeter diameter column. And he measures the stone and cuts it according to this template. Not unlike the way that the 14th and 15th century cathedrals were built using steel templates to cut the stonework and to make it consistent. But unlike house construction, which house construction, I learned there, I never witnessed it, the foundations of a new house might be blessed with a blood sacrifice, the sacrifice of an animal in blood put onto the foundation stones. More commonly, we still see this in Sana'a at the time that I was there, the corners of houses were decorated with ibex horns and sometimes cattle horn, and they were planted into the wall, often at the corner, because again, corner of a square building is its most vulnerable section, and they were often filled with Quranic verses to protect the building. This is something that you see in many parts of the Islamic world. But this did not happen at the minaret site. Instead, once the square base was finished, a large brass insignia reading "Masha'Allah," what God wills, was hung over the door that everybody entered every day to work, that offered God's protection to those working on site, to the structure, and to the people in the neighborhood around. Now, since Ali Sayyid's death, the team was headed by his sons, Muhammad and Ahmed, and each of them had sons involved, and some of their sons had their own sons. So there was a fourth generation of the family working on the minarets when I was there. But as I had described before, there was a growing lack of interest amongst younger members who were finding their ways into other professions. But bringing even laborers to work on the site was always a challenge, and I understood at the time that it had historically been a challenge to find a good, reliable labor team to work on building sites. In fact, not just on the minaret sites, but on housing sites, and there was a fabulous bathhouse that was being built when I was there with all stone domes. All of the laborers came from outside of the city. They came from rural populations, many of them from Damar, from the south of Sana'a, and they were often farmers, and they would come on a seasonal basis. And they would come in circulation, so they would come, they would work for a while, then they would go back to their villages to do necessary business, to be with their families, and then they would come back and work again, rejuvenated a little bit. The 6-day work week began on Saturday and ended on Thursday, and the days were long. We started working at 7:30 in the morning when it was still very cold in Sanaa, and we would work until just after 5 o'clock or before the Maghrib prayer started. And there were only short breaks during the workday. There was a short break in the morning to have breakfast, and then a longer one at lunchtime, which usually involved going for salta. Many of you have had pleasure of eating salta, and then buying cut in the local market, which was chewed for the rest of the afternoon while working on site. And so, as an anthropologist, I found that the time when I got the most information was in the morning, because people were chatty, and they told lots of stories and jokes, but then in the afternoon, as the cut kicked in, people became increasingly silent, and I found myself working in a lot of isolation with dust and debris. But that was interesting in itself. Salaries too were, like I said, they were paid out weekly on Thursday afternoon, and a lot of the salary went to consumption habits, to the tobacco that was either chewed or smoked during the morning, eating salta at lunchtime, and then chewing cut in the afternoon. And cut consumption actually consumed about 1/3 of the laborers' wages. The first day on the job I had mine, and I saw lots of young laborers come in and have theirs. And there's no formal introduction or instruction. It was about finding one's way into the mechanism of the building site, which was really kind of quite tightly regulated, calibrated, because materials had to safely make it from the ground level to where the masons were working on top. And I'll come to that in just a moment. But if you weren't in the right position, feedback was often in language that I cannot describe here. And that was usually about the amount of instruction that was received, even by apprentices. There wasn't a lot of verbal instruction, because the truth of the matter is that as human beings, we have a very difficult time expressing in the linearity of language what it is we know how to do. When I would ask the masters, I would say, at the beginning I had a lot of naive questions. How do you know to do this, or how do you design? And I would always get really fast. It's in my head, or I feel it, which was really interesting to write down, but told me nothing about what they actually knew or how they knew how to do it. And so it was really a matter of just working with them and learning along with the laborers and apprentices that I got a handle on how the buildings were put together and how they learned incrementally along the way. The conditions on the site were dangerous, whether you were working on the top walls, you'll see that in a moment, but teetering, sometimes up to 50 meters in the air, laying bricks without scaffolding around you, whether you were working in the stairwell, passing on materials where debris, dust, and buckets were constantly being rolled down the staircase, or whether you were working most dangerously on the ground, below those who were holding brick, stones, and tools 50 meters above you. I have some stories about that, but I won't tell you that. Many of the laborers that I worked with didn't wear shoes. And the reason that they didn't wear them was not because they couldn't afford them. They owned them, and they put them usually in kind of a window ledge at the beginning of the day. And it was because in the darkness of the minaret shaft, they could feel what was underneath their feet. You know, the stairs were, for the most part, pretty even. But they changed, they did vary in height and breadth. And also they could feel what was there. So they worked often barefoot. They organized themselves. The laborers were fascinating. They organized themselves. There was usually a couple that would kind of take a lead position who had worked with the masons for a long time and on several projects. And stairs were counted out. As it went higher, your number of stairs were increased, but your responsibility was to run down the stairs, say you had 15 stairs, get a bucket, then bring it up to the next person who would be waiting for you, and passing materials all day long in that kind of relay fashion. And one of the things that they did, this is not minaret builders, but they sang hajj, which are traditional work songs. And the reason why I've shown you this picture, this is actually a group of masons from Sada who work in the Zabur style, who are rebuilding the defensive walls of the old city of Sana'a when I was there. And they would sing most of the day. Someone would lead the hajj and the chorus would respond. And it would not only just relieve some of the monotony of working all day in the heat and the dust, but it also served to set a rhythm. for the passing and handling of materials. And the hajjal were also sung by the builders that I worked with. Those who were ambitious as laborers, who were not just coming in from the farm to make a few bob, but who were really there, who thought this could be a profession for me, listened carefully to the kinds of discussions that happened every day on the worksite. So they learned more than just how to pass on materials, but they listened to the masons when they would talk with suppliers, with their team members, with the patron, when they would decide on how to design something. 'Cause the design happened on the fly as the building progressed. They listened and learned from that. And so those who were motivated listened intensely to what was going on, but it wasn't until one became an apprentice and was working next to a master that one had a really had a privileged position to hear what was going on all day long and to sometimes have a hand in the tooling of the materials. The middle section is the largest section of the structure. It usually constitutes roughly about 2/3 of the total height. There's no direct proportioning, but from those that I measured, it's roughly 2/3 on the Al-Hajri minarets. And they are conspicuously decorated with brick patterns, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. And so right that middle section was also the apprentice, in the middle between the laborers, who he, as an apprentice, had to kind of organize and give directives to, between them and the masons who gave him directives. And I'll talk about the apprentice in a few moments. Unlike other parts of the country that I've showed you, whether it's stone and mud construction, Sana'a is predominantly built in kiln-baked brick. And the bricks, in fact, the clay was quarried north of Sana'a, and there were massive kilns outside the city, and there were families that had specialized for generations in producing kiln-baked bricks, and some of these kilns were massive. What they did was they would produce the bricks from a mold, and then when they would sun-dry them for a couple of weeks, and then when they were hard enough, they would be stacked up in the kilns. And they would stay in the kiln for about a 2-week period. And some of these kilns were so large that they could accommodate roughly 35,000 bricks at a time. And different kilns had special relations with different builders in the city and had reputations of creating better bricks than others. So there was also, it was a craft as well, producing bricks. Very importantly, as you can see from this picture and this, minarets were built from the inside out. There was no scaffolding around it. Materials and men moved up and down the staircase, and they were built from the top. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second. Here are two masons. This is Ahmed al-Maswari, and this is what you would call a fana. He was a second in command. He wasn't from the family. He was a mason who was trained up by the family. And I'll talk about their different roles. But they built the walls as the stairs of the central column rose. So everything, all of the structure rose together in a purely vertical plane. And what did change as the building went up were the geometries, always multiples of 4. So the base was square, 4 sides, and then the brick shaft would transform from 4 sides to 8 sides to 16 sides, and sometimes, in the cases of some minarets, 32, but there was always the multiple of 4 for the geometries of these buildings, and it was getting them perfect. That was the mission of the masons. The stone stairs themselves, inside, they were cut stone stairs, and they were supported on very thick tamarisk branches, that were spanned between the central column and the outer walls, with other thinner tamarisk branches running perpendicularly between them. And the stone stairs were built up in counterclockwise direction around them. So, as I said before, the staircase served as the main artery for moving materials and men from bottom to top. And then after the minaret was finished, because of loudspeakers and electronic media, the stairs would rarely be climbed again. They wouldn't be climbed by a muezzin to make the call to prayer, but rather they would only normally be climbed for maintenance purposes. But the stair and the perfection of building them was important. because it served as a brace for holding the whole structure rigid from top to bottom. You can almost imagine kind of like a spring keeping it together. The interior stairwell was a consistent diameter, as I said before, of about 2.4 meters and the column of about 65 centimeters. And what's going on here is you can see that there's a metal pipe. And this came in fixed lengths with threaded ends so that it could be added to as the column was built higher and higher. And they called this the kasaba, which in Arabic actually translates to windpipe. But it was the center of the column. It also constituted the center of all of the geometries. And the normal word for a column is an amud, but in this case they called it a kutub, which actually is an axle or an axis around which the geometries propagated themselves. And you can see here that there is a rope. No one was allowed to touch that metal post, because if it moved out a little bit, the measurement of the geometries for the interior wall and for all of the exterior geometries could be offset. So it was carefully added to all the way up, carefully encased, always kept at the center, and that rope had nails and knots tied at various points along its length, and that was what was used constantly to keep the geometries consistent and the measurements consistent on the minaret. And the verticality, of course, was kept consistent with the plumb line. And as I said before, the staircase went up in counterclockwise direction, but so did the movement of the masons laying bricks at the top. Everything moved in a counterclockwise direction. And climbing the counterclockwise staircase is actually, spiral staircase is more comfortable for some reason than climbing a clockwise one, but also there is the circumambulation around the Kaaba in Mecca, which also proceeds in the counterclockwise direction. The visibility of the craftsmanship also had a hierarchy. So there were those who, the master masons, did all of the exterior decorative brickwork, that which would be seen by the public. The second mason in command, usually one of the younger brothers of the family, would do the interior walls, and then another fana, somebody who was really kind of secondary, usually from outside of the family, just filled in between those two wall surfaces. And that was their job until they could learn how to cut and place the bricks properly. The inspiration, each of the minarets that the al-Masuri made had slight and subtle variations in the geometric designs on the exterior. And the master mason, they were always designed by Muhammad al-Masuri, who would come up with the design. Once they got to the tower section, he would come up with the design, usually in kind of an etch with ink on paper, just drawing geometries, often when he was chewing cut, relaxed on a Friday afternoon. This is also how students studied in Sana, to stay awake for exam studying. So his inspiration came from the houses in the city, and the brickwork in the city. And anybody who's chewed cut in the old city knows that the favorite chewing place is in the mafraj, or in the manzar, at the very top of the house with views over the top of the city, where you can enjoy the beauty of the architecture and the brickwork. The brickwork, I need to say, has no symbolic meaning. And they absolutely denied this. It was purely for the pleasure of the eye, as they would say. And bricks themselves were carved on site. So from a standard square brick, various geometries were carved, and these could be, it was a fixed number that could be carved, and usually junior masons would practice carving them, and these were laid out course by course in patterns that would create these kind of almost oriental rug-like patterns on the surface of the building. And when they would lay the courses, it was usually the job of laborers, sometimes the apprentice, to rub the exterior smooth in order to blend the facing of the bricks together. Now, structurally, this was a bit of a problem. It was the new style in Sana'a when I was there because, of course, you're taking away the patina of the kiln-baked brick. And it means that you're exposing the softer center to the elements. So I remember the Yemeni friend who was in charge of GOFC, the General Organization for the Preservation of Yemeni Heritage. He used to call it the cancer of Sana'a, all this scraping that it was going to destroy the city. But so far, everything's still there. When they reached a certain point, one of the brothers, Ahmed, said that they were not pleased, that the minaret proportions were wrong. The patron had paid for a 44-meter minaret. But when they got to a certain point, they decided that it was all legs and no body, like a hunchback woman bent over. And so they needed to make it higher. They decided to build it 10 more meters in height in order to preserve the memory of their father and the reputation of their building house. And they said to the patron that they would pay for it if the patron was not going to pay for it. No. That's good. That's fine. I'll try to hurry. Never mind about the slip. It's fine. An apprentice. The apprentice is really there not just to reproduce the technical knowledge, but also apprenticeship is a valve used by the masters to allow certain numbers into the trade. So there's a recognition that you are producing not just somebody who's going to work for you skillfully, but you're also producing your own competition. So entry to apprenticeship was very political, and keeping your position as apprenticeship was also extremely difficult. They relied not on verbal instruction, as I said, but really on their sensory apparatus, what they could hear, feel, and see. And so when they got the chance, they would experiment. When the masons had gone off to meet with a client, they would experiment with the tools and carve their own bricks or carve their own stone or lay things themselves in practice. And so there was a real kind of cunning mimicry. This was not unthinking imitation. Rather, this was very thoughtful, careful mimicry. And you had to be careful to do so because you didn't want to cause an affront to your master, to overstep your boundary, to raise your head above the parapet. It was not simply about also craft, the reproduction of the craft, but it was also the creation of social individuals who had a sense of duty and responsibility. And in their workstation, the apprentices had a number of responsibilities. They controlled the flow of materials up the stairs, they stacked them there, and they would pass on materials and tools to the masters. They would also be those who suffered the direct abuse or anger of the masters when things weren't going well, which they learned to pass down the staircase in the same tone of voice. It was fascinating to listen to. It wasn't fun to be at the other end of it, but it was interesting to listen to. And as I said, occasionally they had the opportunity to start carving bricks. And I just want to say this as the last thing about apprentices, and then I'll finish off with the dome, which is short. They start off by carving bricks, and it's really interesting that the brick is the smallest unit of the construction. Then you start to lay out walls. If you're allowed to lay courses of bricks, then you start building the walls in vertical fashion. If you're good at that, then you're allowed to start laying the staircases, which of course are not in kind of a flat plane, but are in 3 dimensions and with complex geometries. And ultimately, what is trained in a good apprentice is the ability to conceive of the structure as a whole, from the unit of the brick to the overall pleasing proportions. The decision to make a minaret not 44, but 55 meters high, to give it the right proportions. An architecture, title, that fills my eye, as the master mason once said to me. So this is the last bit, I'm almost done. The end of the stairs reached this platform here. So inside, above which the column also stopped, but only the steel kasaba would continue. And the staircase stopped, and so they built a number of very complex platforms in order to continue raising the walls and reaching the dome level. In total, there would be 175 stairs in this structure, with windows every every half rotation, letting light into the structure and air for the structure to breathe. And then the complicated part came with the dome. The dome itself was raised at its base more than a meter above where the curvature started, because the masons needed to calculate how you would see it from below. In the same way that Michelangelo needed to think about the size of David's hands when you would see David from below, looking at him in an Italian square. And so the dome had to be raised up to a certain point before the curvature started. And the curvature proceeded in the exact same way as the rest of the structure. Once the curvature started, the rope was fixed at an end point, and the diameter was measured out, but so was the vertical curvature. The walls above the calling platform continued, they were reduced from 4 bricks thick to 3, and the dome continued with the same thickness. Just want to say last thing about the dome. There are 2 kinds of domes. There are just the smooth hemispherical domes, and there are also the mutalaja domes. The word mutalaja is fascinating in itself. I don't have time to talk about it here, but it's a 16 fluted dome, which is one of the most complicated constructions to build perfectly. And they did so with great pride. Again, it was something taken from the early 16th century Al-Madrasa mosque. Now, you can see the kasaba penetrating the apex of the dome. Sorry, here. And it is this one, sorry. And on top of that would be mounted the massive brass hilal. Now, in the dome itself, there were perforations that would allow scaffolding to be built into the walls, but also allow light into the dome, and here's the scary part, so that when the dome needed maintenance, or when you had to hoist the halal out there was a small door on the south side, which conveniently only a small child could really get out. And thank God, I was really glad not to be get out there. And to be able to scale the dome, to whitewash it, to maintain it, and to mount the brass hilal to be put on top. And the hilal came from India. They were also prestigiously imported, sometimes from Damascus or Egypt, depending on the budget. This is one, in fact, that I took a picture of in Cairo. There was prestige with importing them from other places. And then ultimately, the structure was finished off with the whitewashed decoration, picking out the decoration. And this was done by a specialized team of Gus workers who were lowered down on platforms, like scaling a cliff, and whitewashed the building. And this needed to be done on a regular basis. So, just to conclude, this is Muhammad al-Maswari. And as I said before, the hallmark of a master in the trade is being able to get the proportions right. And as I said, he would talk about, it was right when it fills my eye, and he would literally do this. It fills my eye. And he recognized that the young members of his family weren't coming in, so he was forced to train up foreign youngsters from towns and villages around. And he recognized that it was important, though, to preserve the knowledge of his craft, even though the power base of his family for generations was going to erode because of that. Junior masons would stay under his tutelage for a number of years, because even though they had mastered the technical aspects of building a minaret, they needed to learn more about how to get clients, how to deal with clients, how to strike a bargain, where to get your materials, and how to control the flow of supplies, and very importantly, how to manage your human resources on site. The quality, I worked with the Beit al-Maswari mostly, but I did work for short periods with other builders on houses and on a bathhouse one time, which was really interesting. All of these great builders were extremely demanding, could be very pointed, but they all were considered to have very fair judgment, even temperaments, and they were all incredibly highly respected. And they spoke well. So, at the end of the day, what I had argued in my work is that the most important bit of the heritage, perhaps, is not just preserving the existing buildings, but preserving the process of human knowledge that reproduces the changing architectural landscape of Yemen's various regions. So I think that really, at the end of the day, the trade is about a set of human relationships. and ultimately it's about process over product. The very last slide is to show you the construction of a massive mosque in the city, which was inaugurated in 2008. It's called the Saleh Mosque, which was named after the former president, at a cost of $60 million. And also I pointed out here because it was so funny. When I used to work with the masons at the top of the brick minarets, they would point out things that were going on the outskirts of the city with cranes and concrete and say it was terrible. This stuff wasn't going to last. Our things will be here for the next generation. That stuff is going to go. And many of these concrete minarets don't even have staircases inside of them. So it was built at a cost of $60 million, inaugurated in 2008, the same year that the UN reported that 37% of the country's population was malnourished and nearly 50% were living below the poverty line. So struggle has been a long issue in the country, and I'll just end it there.